Okay. Hello, welcome. Thank you all for volunteering to judge today. We're the Council of Ricks. I'm Alyssa.
I'm Izzy.
I'm Pat.
And we're going to talk to you about our government policy proposal, which is about human rights legislation embedded in tax reform.
So we'll start off with the problem. The status quo in Indonesian government has ignored the human rights of palm oil production in favor of corporations, resulting in persistent problems related to worker compensation, child labor, and environmental damage. So with that being said, there's a problem with slavery, child labor, and human rights abuses. There's evidence of human trafficking, violence against workers, slavery, and fraud. The tropical rainforests as well are being endangered with deforestation. Next, I'll talk about the political and public climate. Indonesia is a democratic country led by Joko Widodo. He is a pluralist with ideals brought from Islamic socialism. The omnibus laws passed in 2020 spurred violent protest because the omnibus law legislation has very little transparency. It also abolished minimum wage, removed severance pay, and reduced days off for workers. And it also was created to appease businesses. This created a hostile public environment and angry workers in the past year. So, and then our plan as the Ministry of Environment and Forestry is that we are proposing a two-pronged plan to create a progressive tax-based incentives rewarding union memberships and meeting benchmark standards. In the short term, increasing worker legitimacy and wages, and in the long term, we are legitimizing unions through representation within ISPO for environmental workers policy and maintaining pro-worker standards.
All right, now let's talk about these tax reforms. So the tax incentive structure, as Izzy said, is based on a two-prong approach. It would be a progressive scale where companies would be able to opt in if they wanted the taxes, the tax relief, and it would be increasing based on the number of standards that they meet. So the first standard has to do with union membership in the workforce. We believe that unions are key to, community values and things like that. So the tax breaks would increase for companies as a ratio of the more and more workers inside of their workforce that are a part of these national union organizations. The second part of this has to do with upholding baseline workers' rights. We're going to go into that a little bit more later, but the key there is in relation to wage and environmental standards. The more these companies opt into the program, the less taxes they're going to have to pay, meaning the more profitable it is for them overall, creating kind of a win-win for workers and companies alike.
So the first approach that we mentioned before is that we want to encourage union membership minimums. So the current structure of unions in Indonesia is that there's the overall working population, less than 3% are actually members of the union. There are 4 major unions, and in those 4 major unions, palm oil workers are little to none. 2 years ago, also, the International Labor Organization tried to create a palm oil trade union network, but there was no motivation to join, and there's staunch negative media sentiment about unions in general. So that means that there's current discrimination against hiring members who are a part of a union, especially women who are single mothers who are not a part of the union. So these unions would help with decrease gender discrimination and overall hiring discrimination by also mandating these minimums. We would destigmatize membership in general because companies would then be more inclined to encourage unionship members to get those tax breaks. Additionally, we would increase union efficacy because we would offer union representatives to have a seat at the table during the ISPO regulation certification renewals and discussions so that we can incorporate their voice for more community-based values, environmental protections, and specific laws that they want. So these dynamics will start to gradually change where workers get to actually talk with corporations on a more personable level and changing a little bit of the decision-making power.
All right, so now let's talk about workers' standards. So what are these benchmark worker standards? How are they working? So remember, this is kind of an opt-in program for these corporations in order to receive these tax breaks. But as a group, we've found in our research that kind of the biggest issue that we can tackle within the 1-year time frame established is wages. And the more wages go up, right, the more that we're going to see GDP growth within local communities. And that's going to result in a lot of other positive benefits that just result of increased wages. The biggest problem is that within the palm oil sector, specifically within Indonesia, they're receiving about 37% less wages overall than the agricultural sector within Indonesia as a whole, meaning these workers are specifically being paid less. So by creating some sort of broad establishment to normalize agricultural wages and for contracted workers, it will result in kind of a poverty uplifting scenario. The only mandate that we want to talk about related to this tax policy to make it, ineligible for you to receive any of it is if you violate the zero burn policy already established by the ISPO related to deforestation. Right now it exists, but it's basically a slap on the wrist if you violate it. And by tying financial incentives to these corporations to abide by the zero burn policy, we believe that it's going to be incredibly effective. So speaking of efficacy, let's talk about the feasibility. Right now, as Izzy talked about very well, there is serious political unrest related to both corporations, the government, and rioting and protesting. So in the civil landscape, there needs to be something that will work where a very pro-government, very pro-corporation regime is going to do something for workers' rights. Given how adamant workers have been since the omnibus law has passed in October, the government, being democratic, is in need of something to make them happy. These riots have really started to escalate, and COVID and things like that, it has only gotten worse. So the government is in prime position to negotiate with workers. And when we add in corporate incentives, it creates a win-win that I think is going to be very popular. When we talk about Indonesian corporate tax policy, the one thing that is important to note is it's not like a lot of other countries where the corporations kind of snake out of it. Indonesia loves their money. And specifically related to corporate taxes, they have a long history of harassing companies and going after them. So any sort of tax breaks given to these companies would be extremely beneficial, and they would love it. If you look at the left, this is from the Consumer Policy Institute, I believe it is, and it estimates millions of dollars. They actually did a study related to what we were talking about after the previous regime, before the previous government advocated for some sort of progressive tax structure for companies for sustainability benefits. They did a study on the proposal, and they found that it would have negligible fiscal impacts to the national government, negligible fiscal impacts to local governments related to inefficiency in spending, and it would have overall a very positive effects, just period, right? It's good. Union structuring provides, right now, because of the landscape, it's very difficult to provide unions with environmental policy and just like very rigid workers' rights because of how the government is operating. So by allowing these unions and strengthening their legitimacy and efficacy, long-term, we can give them a voice and a seat at the table in order to negotiate.
Okay. For the first year plan that we have for right now, we would mandate audits to make sure that we know how much of a tax break that these companies are getting. But otherwise, we've already established a springboard for future reform through legitimizing union members and enabling them to have more collective action and bargaining power. And we've also created those standards for the second prong approach that would be updated every 5 years. That would include the ISPO regulations and certifications. And so more workers would have a voice in that area.
So just to summarize what we were talking about today, it's important to understand that, of course, we want stringent environmental and worker-related policy, but because of the current regime, it is impossible to do so. So we need to create some sort of win-win. And we believe that these tax incentives will be favorable to the government, as well as in the long term, we are going to be able to put these union boards in relation to the government and the corporations themselves to long-term create, sustainable growth and get workers' rights included.
So the last kind of big word slide that we have is just kind of the logic and the flow. So if you guys wanted to look at that during the Q&A, it's kind of just where we were talking about through the process and kind of how we got to where we were. Thank you. That's
perfect timing, good team council of Rick. That was just right at 10 minutes, so great job there. I'm now going to start the 5-minute timer for the judges to ask any questions that they have about your presentation.
Cool. Sorry, I can leave that up. Let me redo that. Okay. I won't see your faces though, but I'll change it to the, okay, cool.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. So I just wanted a clarifying point. So the organization that you're representing is the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, right?
Yes.
So in terms of the proposals that you've made, is it sort of a proposal to other ministries in the Indonesian government? Because it seems
Yes.
you're thinking about tax, etc., policies that are under the purview of Ministry of Finance, for instance, right? So
yeah, so we would have to, the representative would talk to the president about it, and then we would need to collaborate with the Ministry of Finance as well to kind of just coordinate our efforts. This helps with combine. Cool.
Can I ask you just a financial question? Because I don't think you touched on that. So obviously you're now giving tax breaks, so the government is getting less tax income.
Yes.
And you're introducing a new audit requirement, which will cost the government money. So how do you kind of reconcile that from a government budget perspective to pay for all of this?
So there are two points to that. The first one is, in terms of GDP, in terms of the palm oil sector only makes up about 1%. This is what the CPI study was talking about. And the CPI study talked about that without effect to the communities whatsoever, due to inefficiency in budgetary spending by the Indonesian government, you could effectively take the entire industry of palm oil and give them a 0% tax rate because of how small it is, their government overall, and given the fact that the majority of their tax rates come from exports and manufacturing industries and income tax as a whole, meaning that taxing businesses is not actually their main revenue stream, and overall it's very limited. Under the side of regulation and auditing, that's already handled by the ISPO Council, so it would just be like an expansion of their duties, but in reality that's something that they're already doing. So from budgetary standpoint, it's feasible. And from a logistical standpoint, organizations already exist doing that.
Can you make the link on how this will address biodiversity loss, deforestation, and reducing carbon emissions aside from just the zero burn policy?
So unfortunately, the nature of the business is that deforestation is necessary. However, we did prioritize like human labor laws because we think that as if they get more autonomy, then they're able to kind of understand what needs to be done on an environmental standpoint. So then they could be able to, they will be able to help during the ISPO certification meetings about what they need to prioritize. And since they'll have more autonomy, it'll definitely be more politically feasible than it is a status quo.
And with more autonomy, small stakeholders will actually be able to join the conversation and the roundtable, and they will be able to address environmental issues because they're affecting them the most, since this is like their community, this is their town, this is their area, and this is like their entire livelihood compared to very large corporations.
The second prong also of standards, it has that zero policy violation and no tax bracket, whatever, rebates, but we could also add something to that too if we want. During the 5-year plan, they could add like a pollution mandate.
I think that's the key, right? When we talk about strengthening union efficacy and legitimacy in Indonesia and Kalimantan specifically, by strengthening these unions and allowing them a seat at the table of the board of the ISPO, they will be in a position to better negotiate their policy goals of community guidelines and social sustainability with these corporations and the government in the long run.
Michelle, I have another one. I don't know if you have one. So you talked about how, very few palm oil farmers are and workers are part of unions right now. Do you think that's purely because of the stigma associated with unions, or do you think it's because unions aren't effectively working in their interest? I guess my question is, how will you ensure that just by farmers and workers becoming part of these unions, that the unions will actually work to improve conditions for?
Right. So we'll work towards decreasing the stigma through the media, because corporations will actually be like, oh, we need people so we can get the money. So they'll be more encouraging of the mandated minimums. And also we legitimize unions itself, because we're giving them authority and power, and by inviting them to these different conversations where they can have a vote or to be able to talk on something. So that's kind of how we're legitimizing unions and kind of motivating other people to join.
And this opens up the conversation for like actual workers and farmers as well, making it a more close to home topic and an issue.
Okay, thank you, team Council of Ricks. That was great. That's the end of your 5-minute judges questioning time. Thank you so much for your presentation and great work.
Thank you for volunteering. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll start the 5 minutes of deliberation for that team.